Grace told me. Alright, so we're going to learn a method called grouping. Now, we did difference of squares, and difference of squares is when you have a difference, you have subtraction, and you have perfect squares. Today's, we can do any, well, it doesn't work 100% of the time, but if I tell you to do grouping, it's going to work. But grouping, grouping when you have, and it's called grouping because the first step is to group the first two terms together and then the last two terms together. So I'm going to group the first two terms, x cubed plus x squared, and then I'm going to group negative 4x minus 4.
Jonathan Munguia to the office immediately. Jonathan Munguia.
Number 2, factor the GCF of each group. So if I look over here and what I've wrote in green, what is the GCF? 1x, x squared. They both have at least an x squared. You want to take as much from them as you can. You can take a full x squared from both. Oh, we're frozen. Okay. When you squared from this one, you have 1x left over. What about when you take an x squared from this guy? Yeah, it's not nothing. Don't put 0 there. If you put a 1 in its place. Because if you go backwards and you distribute, so x squared times x plus 1, if we went backwards, x squared times x is x cubed. If you didn't have that 1 there, then you're not going to have the plus x squared. We're basically undistributing. Okay. And then what would the GCF of this side be? 4. If the first term is negative, then your GCF has to be negative. So it's really negative 4. And your GCF, you're also, another explanation is you're basically dividing by the GCF. So like over here, when you divide something by itself, it's not equal to 0, it's equal to 1. Okay? So when you have negative 4x and you divide out the negative 4, you're left with an x. And then this minus 4 or negative 4 divided by negative 4 is what? 1. So plus 1. If you do grouping correctly, this and this should be identical. If they're not identical, then you did something wrong. Your final answer, you take the outsides, which in my case is the x squared and the minus 4, and then you write what you had on the inside. But you only write that one once. You don't need to write it twice. So the factors are x squared minus 4, x plus 1. And if you wanted to check your answer, x squared minus 4. At the very beginning of Unit 6, we multiplied polynomials. We basically did the reverse of the box. X squared times x is x cubed. X squared times 1 is x squared. Negative 4 times x is negative 4x, and negative 4 times 1 is negative 4. And that was my original problem. X cubed plus x squared minus 4x minus 4. Are there any questions on that example? Let's do another one. So I'm going to kind of work out another one with you, and then I'm going to start calling on some of you, so make sure that you're paying attention. You need to be writing these examples down. So first thing I'm going to do is write out my groups. X cubed minus x squared is one group, and then 9x minus 9 is my second group. What is the GCF of this first group? X squared. Don't tell me 2. It's x with the exponent of 2. Okay, and so if I divide out an x squared from this one, I'm left with x minus, and if I divide out an x squared from there, it's just 1. What's the GCF of my second group? 9. So if I divide out a 9 from there, I'm left with x minus 9 divided by 9 is 1. Do my parentheses match? Perfect. So my final answer is x squared plus 9, x minus 1. Any questions? All right. So the first person I'm going to call on is going to tell me what I need to write for my first group. All right. That would be Dwayne, who's not here. Of course. Katie, not here. JC, what's my first group?
You're going to separate them. Actually, third plus 9, actually second.
Yep, that's my first group. Good. All right. Shayla, what's my second group?
Negative 6 minus 1.
Yes, perfect. All right. Lacey, what is the GCF of this first group? It would just be x squared. Even though this one has a 5, the first one doesn't have a number, so you can't divide them by anything. So they just have an x squared. All right. Who wants to tell me? Anybody. I won't call on you for this one. What's left when you take out an x squared? Just an x plus 5. Good. All right. What is, gosh, he's not here. Someone else not here. All right, Callie, what is my GCF of the second group? So what can you divide -1 and -5 by? If there's nothing, it's just, it'd be 1. Just be 1. But because the first one is negative, we're going to put -1. Okay. So if I divide out, basically I'm just taking the negative out. That's leaving me with x plus 5. All right. Do my parentheses match? Yes. All right. Michael, what is my final answer?
So it would
Take the outsides.
Yeah, I see it. X squared
Mhm.
plus 5. Well, no, plus 5x squared.
Hold on. Take what's just on the outside? X squared and what's this? So -1, and then what's in the parentheses? What's that in parentheses?
X plus 5.
Yep. All right, that's good. All right. Okay, number 9, my groups. Good grief. All right, Isaac, what is my first group? What's the first two things listed there?
Okay. 4
Mm-hmm.
and x3 is
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
5 and x2.
Yep, good. All right, and Kaylee, what's my second group?
-16x plus 20.
Good. All right. All right, Alex Todd, what is the GCF of my first group?
1x squared.
Good. And you can put the 1 or you don't have to. And so when I take out an x squared, this one still has the 4 and it still has an x minus 5. Micah, what's the GCF of my second group?
-4.
Yep. So 16 and 20 are both divisible by 4, but because the first one's negative, we have to put a -4. Okay, and that's going to leave me -16 divided by -4 is 4x, and 20 divided by -4 is -5. Okay, what's my final answers down here? So trinomials are 3 terms, and we saw problems like these with these in Unit 5. So number 1, I'm just going to jump into number 1. We saw a problem just like this, and I said, okay, you need to find 2 numbers that multiply to be -24 and add to be 2. 2 numbers that multiply to be -24 and add to be 2. Any ideas on what those 2 numbers might be? Okay, well, what multiplies to be 24? 1 and what? 1 and 24. 1 and 24, 2 and 12, 3 and 8, 4 and 6. So it's got to be a combination of those numbers. Because this is a -24, one of my 2 numbers has to be negative. So how can I make a combination where when I add them, I get +2? Type in what? 4 needs to be negative. So if you do -6, oh, it's from -6 plus 4, you get -2. But if we do -4 plus 6, we get a positive 2. And negative 4 times 6 is negative 24. So negative 4 and 6, those are my two numbers. And then all we did was, in parentheses, we wrote x minus 4, x plus 6. Now I want you to look at number 2 and tell me if number 2 is different than number 1. Do what? Yeah, the exponents are different. You have an x to the 4th over here when you had an x squared on this side. And you have an x squared where you had an x. So you might see that on some of these problems, and it's the work that you do is exactly the same. So if you have an x squared and an x and just a number, then when you write your parentheses are just going to have x's. That's exactly what we did here. If you have an x to the 4th and an x squared and a plain number, the only change from one problem to the next is that instead of x's, these are going to be x squareds. If you have an x to the 6th and an x cubed and a plain number, any guesses on what's going to be in the parentheses? X cubed. If you have an x to the 8th and then an x to the 4th and then a plain number, any ideas on what's going to be in the parentheses? X to the 4th. There we go. Seeing the pattern. This only works if like the first one is double the middle one and then it's just a plain number on the end. So number 2, the only thing that changes from this answer to over here, because the rest of the problem is exactly the same, is that those should be x squareds. So my answer should be x squared minus 4, x squared plus 6. Let's go down. Let's just go ahead and do number 4. We're going to do number 4 and 6 and then we'll stop. Number 4, I see a number at the very front. That tells me I need to check to see if there's a GCF. Is there anything that you can divide all 3 of those numbers by? 2. Yes. So that's going to be x to the 6th plus 8x cubed plus 15. Before I do anything else, I'm going to set up my answer. I'm going to have the 2. Going to have parentheses. What kind of x am I going to have here? X cubed. So now I need 2 numbers that multiply to be 15, but also add to be 8. 3 and 5. And those numbers go right down here. The very last one we're going to do is number 6. And it has a 2 in the front. I've got a 2, a 1, and a 1. Is there anything that I can divide all 3 of those numbers by? Unfortunately not. So in Unit 5, I taught you the box method, and it was not the most fun. And when I was showing Advanced this, I showed them how they could use grouping instead of the box. Even though the steps are almost identical, most of them preferred grouping. So I'm going to show you that on here. Okay. Now I told you grouping requires 4 terms. This only has 3. So what we do is we bring down the first one. We bring down the last one. But the middle one we split up. Now in order to split it up, we do what we did in Unit 5 with the box method. We start by doing A times C, 2 times negative 1, which is negative 2. So we need 2 numbers that multiply to be negative 2 and add to be 1. What are those 2 numbers? What 2 numbers, when you multiply them, you get negative 2. When you add them, you get positive 1.
Negative 2 and 1.
Nope. Negative 1 and positive 2. So I'm going to put negative 1 and the 2 in these blanks along with an x to the 4th, because the term I split up was an x to the 4th. So I basically just separated that into negative 1x to the 4th and 2x to the 4th. And then you can do grouping. So all of these steps, whether you do box method or grouping, you have to do them regardless. No matter what type of factoring method you choose, you have to do this part. But now, if you like grouping, you don't have to worry about the box and putting stuff in the right spots. You can do that. So I want you to finish this problem out by grouping.